Century, a catastrophe just swept across the globe. It was a pestilence so devastating it literally reshaped societies, economies, and yeah, even the entire course of human history. It was a pandemic that would haunt humanity for centuries, a story of terror, survival, and profound change. This is the story of the Black Death.
To really get a grip on the scale of what happened, we have to start with a number: 50 million. That's the estimated death toll in Europe alone over just a few short years. In some places, it wiped out more than half the population. I mean, that's a number so huge it's almost impossible to even wrap your head around.
And then you get words like these from a chronicler at the time named Angelo di Tura that really bring home the sheer terror. He wrote, "And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world." See, this wasn't just a disease for them. For the people living through it, it must have truly felt like the apocalypse.
So, how could something like this even happen? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break it all down. We'll look at how this 14th century catastrophe unfolded, from its mysterious cause and its terrifying spread, all the way to the profound legacy it left behind.
One of the most interesting little facts is that the name we all know it by, the Black Death, is actually a pretty modern invention. For the people who actually suffered through it, and for centuries after, they just called it the Great Mortality or the Great Pestilence. That more dramatic name, that came way, way later.
But what exactly was this killer? For hundreds of years, the answer was just shrouded in mystery, in superstition. So now, let's unmask the culprit and trace that journey from blaming the stars to pinpointing the actual science.
And the contrast between then and now is, well, it's stark. Back in the 14th century, people blamed miasma, this idea of poisonous or bad air, or they saw it as a punishment from God, or maybe the planets were aligned just wrong. Today, of course, we know the real cause is microscopic.
And here it is. This is a culprit, Yersinia pestis. It's a bacterium they didn't even discover until the late 1800s. But get this, it wasn't until 2010, using incredible DNA technology on the teeth of medieval victims, that scientists could say with 100% certainty that this was the agent of the Great Mortality. A centuries-old cold case finally solved.
Okay, so knowing the killer is one thing, but that's only part of the story, right? How did this tiny little organism bring Europe to its knees? Well, the answer involves a really complex and deadly chain of transmission that scientists are actually still debating today.
The classic theory, the one we all kind of learn in school, is this four-step chain. It starts with the vector, a flea carrying the bacteria. That flea is living on its host, in this case, the black rat. Now, when the rat dies, the starving flea jumps to the nearest warm body it can find, which was often a person, and bam, it transmits the bacteria. But that might not be the whole story. There's some evidence that points to direct person-to-person spread of a much deadlier pneumonic version of the plague, one that attacked the lungs and could be spread just by coughing.
All right, now that we know the microscopic cause, let's zoom out. Let's look at the bigger picture, its journey. How did this one bacterium travel from a single origin point to just engulf an entire continent with such horrifying speed?
Well, the exact starting line for the Black Death is still one of history's great debates. For a long time, the trail seemed to point to places like China or Central Asia. But then, incredibly recent DNA evidence from just 2022, found in graves in modern-day Kyrgyzstan, points to a huge surge in plague deaths there in the late 1330s. That's a full decade before the pandemic really exploded in Europe.
And the story of its arrival in Europe? Man, it's the stuff of dark legend. It's 1347, and a Mongol army is laying siege to the Genoese trading city of Kaffa. As the plague starts ravaging their own troops, the Mongol commander makes a fateful and frankly horrifying decision. He starts catapulting infected corpses over the city walls. And this awful act of early biological warfare? It worked. The Genoese merchants fled by sea, taking the plague with them right to the heart of Europe.
And this map just perfectly illustrates the terrifying speed of its journey. Carried on ships, the plague followed the busiest trade routes of the medieval world. From Constantinople in 1347, it smashes into Italy, France, and Spain in 1348. By the very next year, 1349, it's in Germany and Scandinavia. Within just 6 years, it had crossed the entire continent, reaching all the way to Moscow.
A disaster of this magnitude wasn't just a biological event, It was a social one. The numbers are absolutely staggering, but behind every single one of those numbers is the story of a society completely falling apart under the strain.
I mean, the depopulation was immense. As this chart shows, in Europe alone, the estimates for population loss range from 30% all the way up to a jaw-dropping 60%. Just try to imagine that. 1 out of every 2 people you know, gone. And the Middle East also suffered terribly, losing about 1/3 of its population. No corner of the known world was really safe.
And we come back to Agnolo di Tura, whose words are they're heartbreaking. Father, abandoned child, wife, husband, the very bonds of family, of community, just shattered in the face of so much death. And when he says, I buried my 5 children with my own hands, you feel the raw personal tragedy of it all, and then you have to multiply that by millions.
In all that chaos, fear turned to blame. People were desperate for a scapegoat. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells, and this led to horrific massacres, like the one in Strasbourg where 2,000 people were murdered. At the same time, you had others turning to extreme religious fanaticism, truly believing the end of days had finally come.
But humanity survived, and the world that emerged from the shadow of the plague was fundamentally different from the one that had entered it. So let's take a look at that lasting legacy. Economically, the changes were nothing short of revolutionary. Before the plague, labor was everywhere, and it was cheap. Afterwards, with maybe 60% of the workforce just gone, everything changed. The plague didn't just kill people, it completely re-engineered the economic value of a human life. Surviving peasants and artisans suddenly found their labor was scarce and it was valuable. Wages skyrocketed. And this massive shift in power dealt a mortal blow to the old, rigid feudal system.
And here's a direct link to our world today. The city-state of Ragusa, what we now call Dubrovnik, started isolating arriving ships and travelers for 30, and then later, 40 days, or in Italian, quarantino. And this practice, born directly from the terror of the plague, gave us both the word and the public health concept of quarantine.
And it's so important to understand this. The catastrophe of 1347, that wasn't the end. It was really just the beginning of what historians call the Second Plague Pandemic. The disease didn't just go away, it came back in devastating waves for the next 300 years, embedding this deep generational fear of pestilence right into our collective memory.
Which leaves us with a final, really crucial question. From the origin of quarantine to the economic structures that replaced feudalism, the Black Death sent ripples through time that we can still feel today. It's this stark reminder that pandemics don't just kill people, they remake the world. So how does knowing this 700-year-old story change how you see our own vulnerabilities today?
Dying finally stops, and the survivors have to pick up the pieces of a world that's been completely shattered. Well, today we're going to go beyond the death toll to explore the shocking, chaotic, and ultimately world-changing aftermath of one of the greatest catastrophes in human history.
I mean, the sheer scale is it's almost impossible to get your head around. The Black Death wiped out up to 60% of Europe's entire population. Think about that. In some cities, it was as high as 80%. This wasn't just a crisis. For the people living through it, it was the end of the world. And behind that cold, hard statistic was a level of human grief that is just gut-wrenching. The Italian poet Petrarch wrote those words to his brother, who was the only person to survive out of 35 people in his monastery. He wondered if anyone in the future could ever truly understand their suffering, writing about a fearful and universal solitude over the whole earth. So what did that solitude, that world turned upside down, actually look like on the ground? Well, the first phase was pure, unadulterated chaos. Society as they knew it, it just broke.
Right away, there was a crisis of scarcity. Everything suddenly became unbelievably precious. A chronicler in Florence wrote that things like cakes and sugar for the sick reached outrageous prices. Even basic stuff like burial shrouds shot up tenfold. I mean, with no one left to work the land, farmers just walked away from their crops, leaving them to rot in the fields. Craftsmen locked up their workshops. Everyday life just stopped.
But then, something completely unexpected happened. Something nobody saw coming. Out of all that despair, an economic revolution started to bubble up, and it was going to benefit the most unlikely people imaginable, the survivors. It was a total reversal of power. See, before the plague, you had way too many people and not enough jobs. That meant wages were dirt cheap and peasants had basically zero power. But after the plague, with so few workers left, labor suddenly became incredibly rare and incredibly valuable. All of a sudden, the surviving peasants were holding all the cards. And we're not just talking about a small pay bump here.
This was a life-altering windfall. Survivors were inheriting property and wealth from all their deceased family members. That same writer in Florence noted that people who were once poor could suddenly find themselves rich, showing it off with new clothes and horses. For the first time, social mobility was a real thing for the common person. Of course, the old guard, the wealthy aristocrats and landowners, they were not happy about this new state of affairs. Not one bit. They saw their power just slipping through their fingers, and they were determined to claw it back. So the ruling class responded with force. In 1349, England passed a law to freeze wages right back at their old, low, pre-plague levels. 2 years after that, the Statute of Laborers made it a literal crime to refuse work. You could be put in stocks or even branded on the face. So when they slapped a harsh new tax on everyone in 1380, that was the last straw. The tension just exploded into the English peasants' revolt. But here's the crucial part. The rebels weren't just demanding more money. Their number one demand was the complete and total abolition of serfdom, the whole feudal system that basically tied them to the land as property. They wanted freedom. And even though the revolt was eventually and brutally crushed, you couldn't put that idea back in the box. The feudal system had been dealt a mortal blow. But the changes weren't just economic and political. The plague left these deep psychological scars, and it forced people to search for answers in a world that just didn't make sense anymore. So, what did they think was causing all this death? Well, without modern science, the theories were a wild mix of theology and superstition. The medical faculty at the University of Paris suggested everything from the alignment of the planets and comets to earthquakes releasing poisonous bad air, a theory known as miasma. But for most people, the ultimate cause was obvious. It was God's punishment for their sins. And that intense psychological trauma manifested in some truly bizarre ways. One of the strangest was the dancing plague. You'd have whole groups of people just spontaneously start to dance, seemingly uncontrollably for hours or even days, until they collapse from exhaustion. It was a mass psychogenic illness, really, a physical release for society's unbearable mental distress. But out of this chaos, the first glimmers of modern public health started to appear. They knew the disease was contagious, even if they had no idea why. So moving beyond just prayer, the city of Venice began isolating visitors from plague-ridden areas for 40 days, a quarantina. This was a radical idea, a practical, observational approach that gave us the very foundation of the modern quarantine. So you take all of this, the economic earthquake, the challenge to authority, the psychological shock, and it creates this unique environment. It completely shattered the old world, and in doing so, it cleared the ground for something entirely new to be built. The Black Death effectively ended the Middle Ages. The rigid, land-based feudal society gave way to a much more fluid world, a world where your birthright started to matter less than your skills and your wealth. This wasn't just an economic change, it was psychological. It created a new sense of individualism, where people began to see themselves as the agents of their own destiny, not just cogs in some big divine plan. And that feeling, that sense of living in a broken world, is what fueled the Renaissance. Thinkers like Petrarch, who's often called the father of the Renaissance, felt repelled by their own time. They looked around and believed their world was a ruin. So they looked back, not just to God, but to the classical age of human achievement in Greece and Rome. They were looking for inspiration to build a better world themselves, and that lit the spark for the humanist belief that humanity, not just divinity, could shape the future. It leaves us with a really difficult question. The Black Death was an unparalleled human tragedy, there's no question about that, but it also broke down an oppressive system, it empowered common people, and it inadvertently paved the way for the modern world. It kind of forces us to wonder, can the greatest progress only ever come from the greatest destruction? When you think of the Black Death, your mind probably jumps straight to the unimaginable loss of life.